Tonight's Parsha for this Shabbat is the Parsha of Terumah. Terumah means a few different things, but often translated as gifts or offerings. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha as they take us away from the story of Mount Sinai. We have the big thunder and lightning of Mount Sinai, the big reveal, the big event. But then the weeks that follow, the parshiot that happen post the big event, are in many ways extremely prosaic. Last week we heard about a lot of laws. Mishpatim is full of all the different laws that the Torah begins to lay out, that we shouldn't just be high from the revelation of experiencing holiness. We have to understand to translate holiness into everyday life takes hard work. It takes laws, it takes justice, it takes caring about the application of justice in fair and decent ways. Some of those laws from last week we would feel uncomfortable with because slavery was a part of the economic system of the ancient Near East. But many of the laws we can see are being violated in our own world today, and it breaks our hearts, and we fight against it, and we work hard to create a world in which just laws and an economic system are applied justly to the poor and the rich alike, and that the rich are not benefited in ways in the justice system that makes them have more power or more worth than anyone else. These are some of the truths that we're told we have to learn after the big hurrah of Mount Sinai. And this week goes into excruciating detail about building the tabernacle, building the place in which the tablets will be carried through the time of the desert, and the place in which we're told God's presence will exist. So one week we focus on, in great deal of detail, how human beings have to behave one to the other in order to create holiness. And this week's Parsha is very focused on how do we build a space in which God's presence will be found. Now, many commentators, and I know many of you would share that concern that, what do you mean? Don't we say God is Melo Chol Haaretz Kavodo? God's presence fills the whole earth. Why do we build a place in which to find God's presence? Why do we need to focus on these mundane laws of how people should treat each other and how a system of government should function? What does that have to do with holiness? So I'm afraid this week gives us a great example of what happens when holiness doesn't exist, when injustice rules. And we have been observing this for a long time in this country and around the world. So just to go back a little bit to create a framework to look at Mishpatim and Terumah together. This country learned under the leadership of Roosevelt, who was far away from being a perfect president by any means, and we have a lot to criticize him for in terms of what happened to the Jewish people in Europe. We know that. But what Roosevelt did achieve was, against great odds, creating agencies and a government which proved that it could make a difference in the lives of human beings who were deeply vulnerable, in a great deal of pain and suffering terribly. Under Roosevelt, the government proved every single day that it could make a difference in people's lives. The New Deal, which many anti-Semites in this country called the Jew Deal because so many Jews were involved in the Roosevelt government, and I believe reflecting the best of last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha, to prove that governments, the system by which we create a process that human beings live together, must be filled with the deepest values of Torah, which says that the most vulnerable must be taken care of, and that economic justice must be an integral part of how God's presence will be felt on earth. Ever since then, there are forces in this country which picked up after Goldwater lost in 1964, and then really started steaming ahead under Ronald Reagan, which wanted to undo as its basic philosophy what was then called big government, in order to deregulate and make it possible for rich people to become richer, and for people who did not have wealth to be more vulnerable. And it was called deregulation. It was called destroying the unions, which of course was helping the most weak in society. It was called removing regulation so that business could go unfettered. It included things that removed the limitations on broadcast. Ronald Reagan removed the fairness doctrine in broadcast media, which made it possible for a Fox TV and a Rush Limbaugh to continue unfettered on the airways, saying things completely fabricated, inflaming conspiracy theories, anti-women, anti-immigrant, anti-gay, racist, Islamophobic, etc. And the forces were building which made it possible for a Trump to even exist in our world. And those forces exist on local governments, on state level governments, on city level governments, to undermine the truth that governments, as the Parshiot we're studying right now, should be forces for good, should be forces for justice. And we see what's happened in Texas as a prime example of when forces are able to manipulate government so that it's deregulated to the point of having no ability to watch, to carefully make sure that things like power grids and water systems are there in times of emergency. Mishpatim and Terumah are all about telling us that we have to create holiness. With the words of last week's Parsha about creating systems in which justice is fairly applied. And then this week, the question is asked, okay, how does each of us, we're not necessarily the big judges, we're not necessarily in positions of great power. How can each human being participate in creating more holiness in the world? What about how does each of us participate? In the beginning of this week's Parsha, there's a distinction made between a tax which every household must participate in, whether you like it or not. And you might even call it a regressive tax because there's a set amount. So it doesn't matter, but a half shekel everybody has to contribute to the good of society. Then there are other ways that people have to contribute from their material wealth. But then in the beginning of this week's Parsha, these very moving words are offered, that each person must give according to their heart. They must give according to what they feel in order to contribute to not just the mechanisms that make society work, that's important, but also to create beauty. There's a lot in this Parsha that would make the best gay men feel very good. A lot of jewelry, a lot of beautiful cloth, a lot of descriptions of what the Mishkan should look like, which is so gorgeous, so focused on detail. And it says in order for the beauty to really be God's beauty, every single person must figure out what it is they uniquely have to offer to make holiness in their community. The Parsha begins with this, that each person, so the great artists are obligated to bring great art and create great beauty and to make sure that it's good. Not all of us are great artists. Not all of us have material wealth. But the Parsha says every person must find what they have to offer, what God has given them, and offer their God-given uniqueness to the community. And then we are told it will be a holy space. Vasuli mikdash, make for me a holy place. V'shachanti b'tocham, and then I will dwell, I will be with you. Mikdash, a place of holiness. And how do we do that? Whose heart moves them. What does each of us have to offer that makes holiness possible? I've watched in this past year so many people step forward at CBST. Some to make sure that Friday nights people are welcome to our online services, to make sure people are greeted with a Shabbat Shalom. Some people have stood in front of the mosque for these past 4 years until the COVID made it not possible, simply to say, I stand with those who are most at risk in this moment of heightened risk. Others have given money to our bail fund so that immigrants who are in ICE jail can get out of detention while their cases are being heard. Some people have accompanied immigrants to their ICE hearings before COVID, or have done it via the various mechanisms that we've created. Some of us have worked in our online immigration clinic. We recently, one of our friends, our immigrant friends who has come to us for help, was recently granted asylum because there were CBST folks who helped walk them through the process so that they weren't alone. And this friend who has received asylum in the middle of this will be addressing us, our synagogue, on our March 5th service. I've watched how some of you have made Torah to reach out to others who are alone or lonely or concerned with being alone. I've watched how people have figured out what do they have to offer. Come on Thursdays into our virtual room to make phone calls to elected officials. Some of you have never done anything like that in your lives. You've reached in and you've figured out how you can do it. Others are baking bread. Think about what you've seen around in the world that has been expressed in human hands. Gifts to the community, both in a narrow sense to the CBST community, but to the community at large. When we started the CBST process to build our space, which was going to become our space on 30th Street, I handed out at the meeting, which the congregation voted to go ahead with this process, this verse on a piece of paper. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocha. Make for me a holy place, and I will dwell among you. I gave it to everybody. I said, put this on your refrigerator, on your office desk, wherever, to remind yourself that we're in the process of not just building 4 walls, not just building a physical place. We are about creating holiness so that holiness can find us to exist. Little did I know then that the holiness was not going to be limited to those 4 walls even after we built them. Because what we've done is to create holy space that's not defined by these 4 walls at all. And then on the day that we moved in and dedicated the 30th Street space, we carried our Sifrei Torah 1.5 miles from Bethune Street in that wicked cold April 3rd day. 1.5 miles we marched up to 30th Street. Over 100 congregants shifted and passed the Torahs back and forth so everybody would have an opportunity to carry them, because a synagogue cannot be dedicated until the Sifrei Torah are put into the ark. And that act is a holy act of creating that space of being a holy synagogue. So over 100 synagogue members carried it under our rainbow chuppah up 1.5 miles from Bethune Street. The chorus was freezing cold on the stage we had built in the middle of 30th Street in front of the building, waiting for us to come down 30th Street. Senator Schumer was there, Mayor de Blasio, Lieutenant Governor Hochul, and many, 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 many LGBT leaders and many, many, many other Jewish leaders. 100 different synagogues in the area sent shofar sounders to be there. And then we had the chorus was singing hallelujah as the Sifrei Torah approached. We had blessings from our beloved Fred Davey offered us Christian blessing, and Debbie Almantazer offered us a Muslim blessing. And our president, Nate Goldstein, and Mayor de Blasio cut the ribbon and affixed the mezuzah. But what really made the synagogue dedicated is when we marched the Sifrei Torah into the empty ark. And into that ark, we put the Sifrei Torah. But we didn't just put the Sifrei Torah in the ark. we had left a hole in the back of the ark that would go down into the foundation of the sanctuary itself. And we had asked everybody in a ritual beforehand to take those pieces of paper that had Va'asuli Mikdash V'Shachanti B'Tocham on them, and write on those pieces of paper blessings that people were offering us in the time we would be in this space. And I carried into the sanctuary a paper bag full of all these pieces of paper with these words of Asuli Mikdash V'Shachanti B'Tocham, with everybody's blessing written on these hundreds and hundreds of pieces of paper. And right before we put the Sifrei Torah in the ark, I took all of these pieces of paper and I dropped them down into the foundation of our space. We put the Sifrei Torah in, and the hole through which I put all of those papers was sealed up. And the space, we said Shechianu, all of the past presidents were there and the board of directors. We said Shechianu. And we made the space blessed. But it's the actions of our hearts and our hands, and it's the gifts we bring coming from our hearts that make it holy. V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. And I know that God, the Holy One, dwells among us because of the work, the love of your hearts and of your hands, which make this space so holy. May we continue to be blessed by the work of all of our hands, by the gifts we've been given and we give back. Shabbat Shalom.